The modern-day conservative likes to see themselves as a descendant of not antiquated monarchist thought or something equally ludicrous, but a radical theory of politics that began in the 17th century, liberalism. This applies equally to neoliberals like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They're seen as liberals in a classical sense. Well, I think that this is a myth. The classical liberals thought something far more radical, and I would like to elaborate on this. If you agree with the classical liberal values, I think in today's world, you would be taken to very different conclusions than the ones the liberals came up with. As some points of reference, I'm going to take a few scholars from the Enlightenment, the intellectual environment in which classical liberalism grew up, but also John Stuart Mill, who came a little bit after the Enlightenment. Adam Smith is widely regarded as the father of modern economics and a free market anti-state advocate. John Stuart Mill was hugely influenced by Wilhelm von Humboldt, a real figure of the Enlightenment, and elaborated his own political and economic thought in a number of essays, most famously on liberty. And John Locke is often called the father of liberalism itself, and is known for his theories of epistemology as well as politics and economics. These figures are lionized by modern conservatives, like Dave Rubin for example, and others on the intellectual dark web. I think their affinity to these figures is superficial at best, and I would be surprised if they had ever even opened the wealth of nations. I'm going to argue that the values that define classical liberalism are those of reason, individualism, and freedom from oppression. And I don't think anyone would disagree. This seems to me completely unquestionable. Where I do disagree is the conclusions that these same values take us to in this day and age. The inheritance that conservatives claim from liberalism is really one only of their conclusions, which are of course somewhat out of date. Their reasoning, I hope to show, is a lot more radical. I suppose what I'm saying is that were Locke alive today, he would believe something very different. Liberalism, I think, went through a transformation towards the start of the 20th century, and you can see the change in actual liberals' thoughts occurring in the latter half of the 19th century. I'll talk about this in a moment. It is thought that the three values I mentioned earlier take us to very specific conclusions: property rights, free markets with minimal government intervention if any at all, and to some degree submission of the rule of law and the state. I think this is straightforwardly revisionist. The view of classical liberalism of the human mind is broadly empiricist. We learn everything that we know through experience, and this is best exemplified in John Locke's thoughts on political matters. This seems like a common sense position to have, but in reality it's far more radical. It removes justification of scholastic positions, and though Locke was a Christian, it undermines the authority of the church and faith-based claims. The intersection with reason and science is then clear. Indeed, Locke was a close friend of Sir Isaac Newton. A separation of powers is called for, and the government is formed independently of tradition and dogma. Bertrand Russell, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, said that the liberal is not so much concerned with what opinions are held, as with how they are held. Liberalism is then free from dogma altogether, or should be anyway. This line of reasoning is completely evident in Mill's defense of the absolute freedom of speech. So we can put it this way. The value of reason means that we must always question authority wherever we see it, and unless it can justify itself, it is to be dismantled. One would expect the conservatives to carry that conclusion with them if they were being intellectually honest about their liberalism. This means that all authority, be it state power or market-based corporate power, is subject to these standards. John Locke defended a right to revolution against power that did not have the consent of the governed. To quote, "If a long train of abuses, prevarications and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavour to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected, and without which ancient names and specious forms are so far from being better that they are much worse than the state of nature or pure anarchy, the inconveniences being all as great and as near, but the remedy farther off and more difficult. We can then say that democracy is a tenet of liberalism, and we can see this through the whole tradition, from Locke to Rousseau to Mill. It is often claimed that property is similar, but we have to regard the situation in which they were writing. John Locke also claimed that this appropriation of any parcel of land by improving it, any prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough and as good left, and more the yet unprovided could use. This is what Robert Nozick dubbed the Lockean proviso. Property is justified if and only if there is enough of it left for others yet unprovided. Already we see that classical liberalism is defined not by specific conclusions of property or free markets, etc., but by its humanistic reasoning. I don't just mean to spew quotes here, I'm trying to show that if you really care about liberalism in a classical sense, you would be willing to overthrow what you have held for years if the evidence changes. It is humanism and reason that defines it, not markets or something equally specific. Other liberals held similar views about private property. Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations that, to quote, "Civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all." This goes against what the orthodoxy on these scholars is, but it is all there in their books to see. I highly recommend having a look. We can go on. The other values find similar expressions in highly radical forms. The individualism of classical liberalism is not at all to be bastardized as selfishness. Locke's theory of human nature come through in his vision of the state of nature. It is not, as Thomas Hobbes thought, a war of all against all, but a reasonably equitable society. Indeed, Adam Smith, in the very opening of his far too neglected book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, argues that, to quote, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. No, the individualism is a more humanistic concept whereby people can work to make themselves and one another as good as they can be. This means that they work towards the same humanistic ideals, to become reasonable and intelligent creatures. This individualism is then staunchly opposed to the crushing nature of wage labour, as the classical liberals did in fact argue. For instance, Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, argued that the workman becomes more weak, more narrow-minded, and more dependent. The art advances, the artisan recedes. This followed directly from Adam Smith's own observations that as the division of labour advances, a human being naturally loses the habit, to quote, of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The torpor of his mind renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. Of the great and extensive interests of his country, he is altogether incapable of judging. So the extension of the division of labour and wages is then an attack on democracy itself. The idea is that a human being should not have to submit themselves to external forces in order to work, lest they lose their natural faculties. The excessive labouring times and nature of work today is something that the classical liberals would have regarded as a great loss, the gig economy in particular, I think. We must then consider the government's role in this. Adam Smith suggests immediately following the long passage that I just read that the government must take some pains to prevent this. This line of reasoning was further taken up by John Stuart Mill, who 20 years after publishing On Liberty wrote an impassioned defence of workplace democracy and worker ownership of the means of production in his Principles of Political Economy. He wrote that the identification of the interest of the workman with the efficiency instead of the inefficiency of the work is a happy result as yet only attained by cooperative industry, end quote. And went on to see that the rational conclusion in an industrial society of liberal thought is a democratic socialism. In an industrial society where masses of workers are exploited, Mill expressed exactly what Adam Smith saw before him. No society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. This reasoning is pervasive in all of classical liberal thought. What is to be done is done for the common good, so that all may benefit and flourish. This is reflected in what Adam Smith said about limited liability corporations, or joint stock companies as they were called in his day. The only trades, he said, which is possible for a joint stock company to carry on successfully, without an exclusive privilege, are those of which all the operations are capable of being reduced to a routine, and also that negligence and profusion must always prevail more or less in the management of the affairs of such a company. Adam Smith also writes favourably about enterprises in which workers manage themselves, and the increased efficiency and productivity with which they operate, particularly mines. His analysis of class structure and oppression anticipates Marx in many meaningful respects. A short quote that captures it, I think, is, "As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed." It seems to me, then, self-evident that the humanistic values of the Enlightenment show us a very different picture of the world, and combined with their radical opposition to structures of power, we are compelled to take a very different stance towards our society than conservatives would have us believe. It is not then state oppression we oppose and private oppression that we tolerate, it is all oppression that a classical liberal opposes, and even private tyranny. This may justify state action by the principle of utility to intervene and dismantle organisations of private oppression. In my view, there's basically nothing liberal about something like neoliberalism. It should more accurately be called privatism or something similar. What the classical liberals thought is very much opposed to what they do. If we want a truly free and liberal society, the classical liberals saw that we need one of equality, democracy, and one that is free from unaccountable control. A classical liberal would then not accept today's society. A classical liberal would not accept any society in which people are not free to control themselves, free from all systems of oppression and exploitation, even private ones. What a classical liberal wants to see is the self-emancipation of people, and their own values and identity being expressed in all spheres of life. This might mean deposing the private and state-based institutions through popular and social struggle. This includes their workplace, and democracy in an economy is nothing short of socialism. Their reason-based radicalism is best exemplified in a revolutionary libertarian socialism today, in the tradition of the anarchists and left-wing communists, in my view. Only then will freedom, in the way the liberals wanted, be achieved.